Hi, this is Brad Bright and the God is the Issue podcast, where we seek to show how God is the issue in every issue. A great man once told me, if you don't need the credit, you can change the world. In today's world where the desire for power, prestige, and fame is both inside the church and outside the church, that statement really caught my attention. The man who shared that bit of wisdom with me actually did change the world, but most people don't even know his name. And the thing is, he'd be just fine with that. As his son, however, I hope you will indulge me as I share with you just for a few minutes the four and probably most important things I learned from watching him that ultimately changed my life. But not just my life, the lives of millions of other people as well. To this day, whenever I travel, whether it's in the U.S. or outside of the country, one thing I hear again and again and again is, Brad, your dad changed my life. See, on July 19th, 20 years ago, my dad, Bill Bright, passed away, but not before he'd changed the course of history. He accomplished what few people ever have. But you've probably never heard his name, and there's a good reason for that. You see, in 1951, he founded Campus Crusade for Christ, which became the largest missions movement of the 20th century, probably of all of history, reaching into every corner of the globe. In the 1960s and 1970s, he stopped the radical movement dead in its tracks. He wrote the Four Spiritual Laws, which has been printed over 2 billion times. That's right, 2 billion. He was the impetus behind the Jesus film, which has been translated into over 2,000 languages and viewed by 7 billion people around the globe. It's been translated into more languages than any film in history. Disney would only love to have that sort of record. And the list goes on and on and on. So why have you never heard of him? It's very simple. As he said to me shortly after I graduated from college, Brad, if you don't need the credit, you can change the world. It's a principle he lived out in front of me, and I have never, ever forgotten. You see, he never made it about Bill Bright. He started Campus Crusade for Christ, not the Bill Bright ministry. At the height of the Jesus movement in 1972, he brought 85,000 young people to Dallas for a week of intensive training. It was called Explo 72. Today, when most people talk about Explo 72, you hear the names Billy Graham and Johnny Cash mentioned. Rarely Bill Bright, and even though it was a Campus Crusade for Christ event. When my dad died in 2003, he'd worked himself out of a job. There were 27,000 full-time, fully trained staff and another 200,000 fully trained volunteers around the globe. You see, he replicated himself, so he was no longer necessary. When my wife joined the staff of Campus Crusade for Christ, she started reading a book that my dad had written called Come Help Change the World. And she remarked to her roommate, this Bill Bright guy, he's a pretty amazing guy. Her roommate said, yeah, that's the guy who started Campus Crusade for Christ, the organization that you're joining. See, up until that moment, she'd never even heard of Bill Bright. But she knew what the distinctives of Campus Crusade for Christ were, and that's why she joined. You see, it wasn't about Bill Bright. It was about changing the world for Jesus Christ. If you don't need the credit, you can change the world. My dad was smart. He was a born leader. He slept 3 to 4 hours a night for 50 years. He traveled 80% of the time. He was a man of character and compassion. He would fast 1 day a week and take the money he saved to give to feed the poor. Now, these are all great qualities, but if I stop there, you will never understand what enabled him to accomplish what he did. None of these things explain what set Bill Bright apart. Growing up, I heard a number of times from my mom and dad, they'd say to me, Brad, we don't really care whether you become the president of the United States or you dig ditches for the rest of your life. Our greatest desire is that you would learn to love Jesus with your entire heart. I think Donald Miller in his book Blue Like Jazz really captured the true genius of my dad in this regard, what made him who he was. Let me just read you a quick excerpt from that book. A guy I know named Alan went around the country asking ministry leaders questions. He went to successful churches and asked pastors what they were doing, why what they were doing was working. It sounded very boring except for one visit he made to a man named Bill Bright, the president of a big ministry. Alan said that he was a big man full of life who listened without shifting his eyes. Alan asked a few questions. I don't know what they were, but as a final question, he asked Dr. Bright what Jesus meant to him. Alan said Dr. Bright could not answer the question. He said Dr. Bright just started to cry. He sat there behind his big chair in his big desk and wept. When Alan told that story, I wondered what it was like to love Jesus that way. I wondered quite honestly if this Bill Bright guy was just nuts or if he really knew Jesus in a personal way so well that he would cry at the very mention of his name. I knew then that I would like to know Jesus like that with my heart, not just my head. That was the genius of Bill Bright. He loved Jesus passionately. About a year before my dad passed away, my wife asked him, what was the secret to finishing well when so many others had compromised their faith or fallen in disgrace? My dad said, 2 choices. First was the initial choice to give up all his personal ambitions, to give up all his worldly desires, and to follow Jesus, holding nothing back. But the second was the daily choice to start every morning on his knees, asking God to walk around in his body, think with his mind, talk with his lips, and love with his arms. How many times did I hear him say that over the years? My dad called that being a slave of Jesus by choice. About a year after my dad had decided to follow Jesus, he had joined a Sunday school class, young professionals class at Hollywood Presbyterian Church taught by Henrietta Mears. And he said after he'd been there about a year, he realized there were really 2 groups in that room. There was the group that talked about Jesus, that said, God bless you. He said, but there was the other group who pursued Jesus and loved him passionately. They were all in. And he said he realized he needed to make a choice. Which group was he going to be a part of? And he said, it was an easy decision. I decided to go all in. And from that day forward, he started and ended every day on his knees, and he never looked back. His passionate love for Jesus became the driving force behind everything he did and everything he said. But how did he get to that point? I remember about a year after graduating from college, I was sitting around the kitchen table with my mom and dad kind of after dinner, just chatting. And my dad started talking about Billy Graham. He said, I really think God has blinded Billy to his own greatness. And my mom leaned over and whispered to me, I think he's blinded someone else too. And at the time I agreed. But as I've thought about it over the years, I realized that's not what God did. What God did is he opened the eyes of Billy Graham and Bill Bright to the greatness of the God that they served. This majestic, powerful, loving, sovereign God. See, it was their view of God, their huge view of God, that set them apart. And because they had this huge view of God, of course they had huge faith, because faith can never be bigger than your view of God. As my dad said, the most important thing to teach another believer is the attributes of God. That is who God really is, his character, his nature, and his heart. You see, the Christian life is simply a trust relationship with the living God. You can never completely trust someone that you don't know deeply. The point of the Bible is what? It's not to teach us how to live. A lot of people think it's to teach us how to live. It's not. The primary point of the Bible is to teach us who God is. And therefore, the Christian life will never really work for you if you don't first delve deeply into the character and the nature and the heart of God. You see, any one of us can be a Bill Bright or a Billy Graham. Now, God may not give us the same job description, but he will use us just as mightily if we take the time to discover who he really is, to get to know him, and to get to know his heart, and then to completely sell out to him. 99% is not enough. Let me ask you, What if Jesus had decided he was going to do 99.99999% of the Father's will? It would have never worked, would it? And that's the point. Do you want to fully experience the joy and peace that Jesus promised? Then 99% is not enough. Do you want God to use you mightily to change your world? Then 99% is just not enough. Let me share with you one final key I learned from watching my dad. The Christian life is not about what you do. That's right. Christian life is not about what you do. A lot of people think it is. It's not. The Christian life is about who you focus on. As Hebrews 12 says, fix your eyes on Jesus. Let me give you a for instance. Remember when Jesus said to Peter, follow me and I'll make you a fisher of men? Now, many people say we need to be sharing our faith, right? Well, yes and no. If that's the starting point of the conversation, wrong. They've got the cart in front of the horse. What did Jesus say? He did not say, go fish. Jesus said, follow me. That was his command. His promise was, if you do follow me, I will make you fishers of men. In other words, the closer you follow Jesus, the more you will naturally want to fish. So if you aren't fishing and you have no desire to fish, the problem is not that you're not fishing. The problem is you're not following very closely. That's how the Christian life works. It's about your focus. Behavior is simply a symptom of your focus. 20 years ago, Bill Bright walked into heaven and heard his Savior say, well done, good and faithful servant. If you'll internalize these truths that were part of my dad's daily life, you too will see God work in amazing ways. Remember, if you don't need the credit, you can change the world. Make sure you know who God really is, not just who you think he is. Work hard to keep your focus in the right place. Fix your eyes on Jesus. And lastly, seek to love Jesus passionately. That was Bill Bright's real genius. God really is the issue.